everyone and welcome to Polina's Pages. Today we're doing part 3 of my new Dracula series. Please make sure to watch part 1 and part 2. And without much further ado, let's dive straight to where we left off. Lucy taking a turn for the worst. She was ghastly, chalkily pale. The red seemed to have gone even from her lips and gums, and the bones of her face stood out prominently. Her breathing was painful to see or hear. So Lucy is quite literally on her deathbed. This gives a whole new meaning to the phrase deathbed because Lucy is quite literally dead. She's dying, she's turning into the undead because she's no longer fully a person. She's this mix of vampire and human, and her human side is fighting to stay alive. And this is why Van Helsing realizes that she needs a blood transfusion. So he decides that it should be Seward because Seward is younger, he's healthier, he also knows that Seward loves Lucy, but then they see Arthur coming along, and so of course the obvious choice is Arthur because he is young and brave, and he's also Lucy's chosen lover. And I suppose there's something very romantic in the idea that like you give your life to someone, like if you are not the one who is dying, that you can help someone else live, especially if it's a romantic partner. So it goes into this emotional bond that's beyond just loving someone, it's actually proving that you love them. But now you're here, you are more good than us, old or young, who toil much in the world of thought. Our nerves are not so calm and our blood not so bright than yours. Arthur is very eager and passionate about Lucy, and so it's this idea of love conquers all. But is it enough to conquer the fact that in the previous acts, Dracula has literally violated her? It was the scene of sexual liberation when he has drunk her blood and stolen her virginity. Remember when the dark clouds passed over the white pale moon? The blood on the white nightgown was this image of like sexual violation. So is it enough for Arthur's love to save Lucy when Lucy is not quite so pure anymore? Because at the time, being not a virgin for a young Victorian woman would have been seen as being the fallen woman. And here she's quite literally the fallen woman because she's turning into a creature that's something worse than a woman, that's a monster, that's inhumane. And so at the end of Arthur's blood begins to bring Lucy back to life, and she grows more rosy and she grows less pale. But Arthur, on the other hand, he's the one who grows more pale. At the time, those women would have been seen as drinking the men's blood. They would have been a danger to the purity and bravery of men themselves. So women and men would have been pure in different ways. Where women would have been pure because they're this innocent, naive young flower, men would be pure because they are strong and brave and incorruptible. And this woman is the temptation that leads him astray, this Adam and Eve version of the story where the woman brings down the fall of humanity. At the end of the operation, the doctors attend to both Arthur and Lucy, but Arthur cares only about Lucy. This is a very traditional image of masculinity and femininity. Arthur's strength is constantly juxtaposed to Lucy's weakness. This is Dr. Seward's comments on this. It is how he sees the scene, and so we get some insight on what he views the man's job to be. Dr. Seward inspects Lucy's neck and finds 2 punctures with no disease, but they look worn as if they have been used many times. Seward does not realize the significance. Oh, it's merely 2 strange wounds. But Van Helsing realizes that Dracula is on the prowl once again. So he bids Seward to watch Lucy for the entire night and to not leave her sight because her life depends on it. And indeed, as soon as there is a man in the room watching after her, she's fine. She was not fine with the nurses, with her mother watching over her, so it's implied that the female figures are like too weak to resist to Dracula's charms, because Dracula is of course this seductive young foreigner from abroad, as we've talked about these themes of like sexual release and how foreigners were viewed at the time. Seward stays with Lucy for several days, and indeed she begins to improve and recover very quickly. She writes that Arthur feels very, very close to me, and that health and strength give love reign. So she feels Arthur's love, and again we see the implication that it's more than just blood, it's a life force. It's a hugely important part of her feeling and her situation. And eventually Lucy begins to send Seward out, and what's the true tragedy here is that that's her downfall. So she feels like she's better, and she feels as if she's going to be just continuously getting better. She doesn't think that, oh, as soon as Seward is gone, I'm not protected. I'm this weak, fragile young woman who's alone. No, she's used to thinking of herself as this independent young woman who can get along just fine. And as soon as she sends Seward out, the next day they come into Lucy's room and she's more horribly white and bad looking than ever. Even the lips were white and the gums seemed to have shrunken back from the teeth, as we sometimes see in a corpse after a prolonged illness. The doctors rush to do another blood transfusion, and this time Arthur isn't around, so of course Seward volunteers, and as he gives his blood and he grows weaker, he stoically carries on, because of course during the time, like, what is no anesthesia, nothing to kind of keep your levels of blood fine. So the only way that they treat people after they have given a blood transfusion is to give them brandy, like an attempt to get the blood running, the alcohol going. But he notices that Van Helsing takes a lot less blood from Seward. And Seward, I mean, there's an implication that it's kind of touched his ego, like, oh, am I not as strong as Arthur? But instead, Arthur is her lover, her fiance. You have much work to do for her and for others, and the present will suffice. So Van Helsing, of course, realizes that it's more than just blood, it's a romantic bond, it's a marital bond, and also Seward needs his strengths, because Arthur is not a medic. As much as he loves Lucy, he cannot help her at this moment. And Lucy soon starts looking better because, of course, Van Helsing is an attentive doctor and he's an experienced doctor. And he's also a doctor from the Netherlands, from abroad. He's used to these situations. He doesn't just close his eyes and not see the obvious in front of him, that there's some occult, mysterious explanation. The next day, Van Helsing shows up with flowers, garlic flowers, and asks her to put them in the window and around her neck. Oh yes, they, like the lotus flower, make your trouble forgotten. It smells so like the waters of Lethe. Lethe is the river of forgetting. Oh, this makes me smile because it brings me back to one of my favorite poems by Baudelaire, Le Lethe. And so this river of forgetting, he wants to ensure that Dracula will forget her scent. This is why he rubs it all over her. It's almost like your natural smell as a female is so seductive that we need something to cover it up, and that's why they produce the garlic flowers. That's why he hangs them around her neck. And of course he hangs them around her neck because this is the most important part, this is the most sensual part, this is the erogenous area, because Dracula drinks the blood of his victims from there. It is here that he punctures her neck and he makes those wounds. And this seems like an odd superstition, and for Seward, of course, this is so strange. It's almost grotesque, but he decides to trust Van Helsing because he was Van Helsing's student. He knows that the doctor has experience. He knows that he's a good man and wouldn't do something just because he wants to, like, defile the body or anything. And the two of them leave, and Seward is so happy because he thinks that everything's going to turn out fine now. He has placed the flowers, Lucy seems to be getting better. But Seward cannot shake the premonition, because last time he said, oh, everything will be okay, was the time they came in to find Lucy bitten once more. He cannot shake that feeling of awe and vague terror. And the chapter ends with that bit of foreshadowing, because, oh dear, chapter 11. I never liked garlic, but tonight it is delightful. Lucy already finds comfort even without knowing it. It's almost like the human part of her feels that the vampire part is being suppressed. And in this passage, she compares herself to Ophelia, where Ophelia dies and drowns, and she finds this sort of peace amongst the flowers while she's floating in the river. So yeah, not a very happy, not a very positive comparison to make, but once again, it's foreshadowing. We see the instance of the writer's craft, and we also see that, again, I think we refer back to this whole thing of drinking blood being a very sexual image and a discussion of the sexual norms and values and morals of the time, because of course we have the phrase petit mort, so the small death denoting sexual pleasure, which originated in the 16th century. So she's quite literally dying, and it's this sort of Victorian belief that no, women shouldn't just get carried away, because when they get carried away and when they enjoy themselves, that's when society collapses. And the next day, Van Helsing inquires about Lucy's state, and the mother is so happy to report, like, oh yes, Lucy's certainly feeling much better, but you know, doctor, I'm the one that helped. Van Helsing doesn't understand why the mother thinks she's helped, And then the mother says that she took away the garlic flowers because they were stuffy. So, for the first time, the professor is taken apart by despair. He raises his hands, he cries, he sobs from his very heart because he knows it is too late. The tragedy is the poor mother unknowingly signs her daughter's death warrant. And again, Lucy is deathly pale, but we can't take the blood from Seward. He just had a blood transfusion. Arthur is not there. This time it's Dr. Seward. The observant reader will know that it's the third time, much like her three suitors, much like Dracula visited her 3 times when Mina was there. So we see the significance of the number 3. We see that this is some sort of perverse take on Christianity's value of the number 3 as important, as lucky, as like biblical and holy. And we also see Dracula take cruel pleasure in enjoying the hunt and playing with his victims and turning Lucy's life story into his own entertainment. Lucy observes in her diary that, since however Dr. Van Helsing has been with me, all this bad dreaming seems to have passed away. The noises that used to frighten me out of my wits, the flapping against the windows, the distant voices which seemed so close to me, the harsh sounds that came from I know not where and commanded me to do I know not what, have all ceased. Van Helsing's methods of garlic and constant surveillance, of course they prove effective because he knows the struggle, he knows what is going on, but the issue is once again the theme of madness and insanity, because the issue is he knows what to do, he knows that it works, but if he tells anyone else, it will stop working because they'll just think he's insane. It sounds like the mutterings of Renfield, and they'll just take him away and they'll say, oh, it's the stress, he's a doctor, he's always under stress and pressure, he's not the one who should be helping Lucy right now. So he's is just one man in the entire household, and everything seems to be against him, and Dracula seems to be manipulating the entire household into acting to help when all they do is bring more harm to Lucy. Then there is an insert from a gazette about an escaped wolf. It's an interview with the zookeeper called Thomas, who hears the wolves howling, and when he gets to the cage, a tall, thin man with a hooked nose and a pointed beard, with a few white hairs running through it. He had a hard, cold look and red eyes, and I took a sort of mislike to him, for it seemed as it was him they were irritated at. Dracula, because of course it is him, then subdues the wolves and walks away. It's sort of like his moment of, yeah, I'm the one in control, I'm the one who's the boss of the wolves, definitely not you, you petty human, because of course this aligns with his attitude of these humans as peasants, and he's the true like nobility, he's the true pure Transylvanian noble. That night the wolf escapes the cage, and when Thomas goes to examine the cage, the bars are bent, so it's clear that it's not natural, that there is an element of the supernatural about this. And later the wolf is found with glass in his fur. And I won't talk about why that's significant for now, I won't spoil what happens later on. But back to Dr. Seward and Renfield. Suddenly Renfield attacks him. Again, there's no reason, but potentially just the rage that Dracula feels, that he channels through Renfield. And as he attacks Dr. Seward, he cuts his wrist with a knife. It's lucky that it's the wrist, of course, and not like his heart. But instead of making a further cut, as soon as he sees the blood, he goes feral, and he goes down on the floor and licks it up like a dog, the blood which has fallen from my wounded wrist, announcing, the blood is the life, the blood is the life. Renfield is restrained, and Dr. Seward watches him get taken away. On the 17th of September, Van Helsing sends a telegram to Dr. Seward asking that he's not there for the night and he has a bad feeling and he should go there at once, but the telegram reaches Seward too late, and so he only arrives on the 18th, and of course for the night Lucy was left unattended. And how many fates were sealed because of late telegrams? Romeo and Juliet was just one example, and now poor Lucy joins the list, because on that night she goes to bed as usual and she's woken by a flapping in the windows, and her mother goes down to settle in her bed, and of course her mother has a weak heart, and so the two of them lay together, and the mother senses that something's bad happening to her daughter, so she wants to comfort her, but then she gets very nervous by the flapping of the window, and then a wolf literally bursts in and shatters the glass. Again, that wolf from earlier on. Mother cried out in a fright and struggled up into a sitting posture and clutched wildly at anything that would help her. Amongst other things, she clutched the wreath of flowers that Dr. Van Helsing insisted on my wearing around my neck and tore it away from me. She then proceeds to have a stroke and die right there, leaving poor Lucy alone with no protection. Yes, very motherly behavior. Lucy tries to resist, but we see these specks of dust similar to Jonathan's experience with the three women hypnotizing them, and she's terrified because she's left alone with the dead. And so that's why she writes on this piece of paper. This is her memorandum, so it's like her last living memory, and she folds it on her breast and she leaves it there. She says, "Goodbye, dear Arthur, if I should not survive this night. God keep you dear, and God help me." And she dares not leave the room because her mother is there, and she hears the howling of wolves, and she knows that there's no one there to help her because all the servants are slumped on the floor. On the 18th of September, Seward finally arrives, and just as he's like, "Oh, this house seems sort of empty. Where is everyone?" Just as he's contemplating what to do, not in the least processing that there's a rush, Van Helsing shows up, and he says to Seward, why were you not here? And he explains that the telegram arrived late, and they realize that something terrible has happened, so they use a saw and a knife to break through into the window. Yes, breaking and entering, but of course for a good cause, showing that potentially a crime is not a crime in desperate situations. But then again, if we say that, how do we determine the limits during war? So I think it's specifically that crime is not a crime if it's used for the greater good. They find 4 servant women just lying there drugged. When they walk into Lucy's room, they see her mother covered with a white sheet, showing her look of terror. The wreath of flowers is around her neck, Lucy's half dead, her breathing not visible, her 2 pinpricks on the neck more mangled than ever. Van Helsing realizes it's not too late yet, and they run to fetch the brandy, and waking the crying maids, ask them to prepare fire and hot water. They place Lucy into the bath, and miraculously it is actually not too late. She manages to come back to life. But where do we get the blood? Seward and Helsing are both, they're done. They've already given her blood. Ironically, she drinks their blood even while she's not a vampire again, and suddenly Quincy appears. So Lucy seems to be both the luckiest and the unluckiest woman in the world, because Quincy is of course a godsend. A brave man's blood is the best thing on this earth when a woman is in trouble. You're a man and no mistake. The transfusion improves Lucy's breathing and heartbeat, and they let Lucy sink into a deep sleep and give Quincy a glass of wine. They find the memorandum. Seward reads it. He does not understand. Van Helsing reads it. He of course understands the significance. Quincy is quick to realize that there is some unnatural cause, because Lucy has had the blood of 4 grown men pumped into her, and yet something is taking it out. And he also offers to be the friend that they need. In the afternoon, Lucy wakes up, and the first thing she does is feel for the paper, and once she realizes that it's there, she realizes it's not a dream and that her mother is dead. So the 3 men try to console her and to comfort her, but of course it's very difficult because she realizes the full extent of what has transpired and her mother has died. During the night, all 3 men notice that the teeth look positively longer and sharper than usual, because she breathes easier and stronger. And she asks for a telegram to be sent to Arthur, and the 2 lovers reunite. However, Seward fears that Lucy will not survive for much longer, and so the house enters into a subdued silence. Mina writes to Lucy that Mr. Hawkins has decided to let Jonathan and Mina live with him, and also to leave them their inheritance. The letter is, however, unopened because Lucy is not well enough to write a response. Renfield has another episode where he tries to kill the men who are hired to carry Dracula's coffins, because he says that my master will not be happy. Mr. Hawkins died, leaving Lucy and Jonathan the fortune, and the 2 are to head up to London for the funeral. No news of Lucy, but Van Helsing wakes up Arthur so that they can say their final goodbyes. What follows is a highly disturbing scene where Arthur leans in to kiss Lucy, but Van Helsing murmurs not yet, and gradually Lucy sinks to sleep. Then there's a huge change, and she becomes like those 3 women and seductively asks Arthur to kiss him, but Van Helsing pulls him back before she drinks his blood. Lucy thanks him and calls him her true friend. Then Van Helsing allows Arthur to kiss her on the forehead because it's clear she's back to Lucy. Seward exclaims that at last it's the end of her suffering and there is peace. But gravely Van Helsing announces that it is only the beginning and they can do nothing but wait and see. The chapter begins with Dr. Seward's diary, where they make arrangements for Lucy's funeral to bury her with her poor mother. They take the legal matters onto their hand, and as well as that, the organization of the funeral. When they lift the sheet, they Both started at the beauty before us, the tall wax candles showing us sufficient light to note it well. All Lucy's loveliness had come back to her in death, and the hours that had passed, instead of leaving traces of decay's effacing fingers, had but restored the beauty of life, till positively I could not believe my eyes that I was looking at a corpse. The professor, unlike Seward, realizes that this is because Lucy's transformation is now taking place. She begins to rot from the inside rather than outside because she is now the undead. Ironically, the funeral director says that, oh my gosh, she almost looks as if she's sleeping, she's not fully dead, and that is the case. Bravely, Van Helsing fetches flowers and a crucifix to place on Lucy, and his aim is not to reverse the transformation but rather held it in because he wants Arthur to have a chance to say goodbye to Lucy as she is now, and then he plans to decapitate her and also to drive a stake through her heart. Of course, Seward doesn't understand what was the point of this. He is completely disturbed, he's worried about it, and he asks what sort of grotesque ceremony is this, what is the purpose of this autopsy, you're just defacing an innocent young body. By waiting for Arthur, the tragedy is that he ensures Arthur says goodbye to Lucy when she's not a human, essentially, and this demonic ritual that Van Helsing plans to do in terms of decapitating Lucy, he justifies to Seward. Were you not amazed, nay horrified, when I would not let Arthur kiss his love, though she was dying, and snatched him away by all my strength? Yes, and yet you saw how she thanked me, with her so beautiful dying eyes, her voice too, so weak, and she kissed my ruffled hand and blessed me. Yes, and did you not hear me swear promise to her, that so she closed her eyes grateful? Yes. In the morning, Van Helsing wakes Seward and says, don't worry, I know you were worried about this demonic and grotesque ritual that we're going through, but we're not going to do it because it's either too late or too early. During the night, the golden crucifix has been stolen by some poor woman who didn't know what was the aim, and now she's bringing about the curse atop of her because Lucy is essentially turning into the undead. And then we go through the legal matters, which I think is quite interesting. All of Lucy's property is transferred to Arthur, and actually Arthur's father dies, so Arthur becomes a lord. So it's kind of implied that with these social acquisitions, their standing goes up. So the more grief you have, the more your position goes up. And I think it's a commentary on material wealth, because I'm sure that all of the characters here would rather that they were still poor and happy rather than woefy and with all of this grief. Ultimately, Arthur thanks Van Helsing and Dr. Seward for all the work that they have done because he knows that Seward loved him, and I think this is once again a testament to Arthur's character. There are many such testaments throughout, that Arthur is an extraordinarily brave man, because I think it takes a very brave and noble man to admit that actually you weren't the one who helped save your love even when the love has chosen you. He too remarks that Lucy looks useful and like she's sleeping. The irony again is that she's sleeping and she's using the strength to hunt her victims. And since all of Lucy's stuff is now his, Van Helsing asks him for permission to dig through Lucy's diary, and Arthur is very offended that Van Helsing called him Lord. He says, like, please no, we are still friends, nothing has changed just because of some mere like social status position, and please of course read through Lucy's diary because I think that this is what she would have wanted, and I trust you because she trusted you. Then we cut to Mina's diary. Mina and Jonathan are out for a walk in London after the funeral when suddenly poor Jonathan stops dead. He was very pale and his eyes seemed bulging out as, half in terror and half in amazement, he gazed at a tall thin man with a beaky nose and a black moustache and pointed beard who was also observing the pretty girl. He was looking at her so hard that he did not see either of us, and so I had a good view of him. His face was not a good face. It was hard and cruel and sensual, and his big white teeth that looked all the whiter because his lips were so red were pointed like an animal's. Jonathan kept staring at him till I was afraid he would notice. I feared he might take it ill. He looked so fierce and nasty. Again we have a description of Dracula with a black mustache before it was grey, but through drinking blood he had managed to restore his youth in life, and so it had stopped aging. He's tall and thin, a slim fit man in the peak of his life as he feeds off of the energies of others, and he is of course planning his next victim. The intensity of his gaze is terrifying because this isn't a casual look, it's the sort of look where you're planning on capturing your victim as soon as possible. For Jonathan, this is his first encounter with the occult since Transylvania. The poor man has been spending all this time trying to gaslight himself into thinking that he's insane, he shouldn't think about it anymore, it's all good now that he's in his home country England where everything can be great and fine. But actually we of course know that the events
are far from being over. So he's being hysterical and he's trying to process this vision, and he doesn't want to worry Mina, and so he dismisses it as a hallucination. The sad thing is that if Jonathan and Mina communicated more instead of caring for each other's feelings, I think a lot of this would have been resolved quicker, because Mina is nervous to trigger Jonathan, so she doesn't ask him, and then the two just forget about it, and she goes home and she's kind of like, oh, what a terrible day it has been, poor Jonathan, he's still not over his brain fever. And then she receives a telegram saying that Lucy is dead. The reader might have forgotten that this is an epistolary novel, meaning that pieced together out of segments and fragments and letters, so it's not a linear narrative where we find out everything and the characters find out everything at the same time. At a lot of points in the novel, we know more than the characters do. September 22nd. So Lucy is placed into a marble mausoleum and they attend to her body, and Arthur remarks that when he transfused the blood into Lucy's body, he felt like they were married. Even though they weren't married by the church, they were married in deeper ways. So once again, there are deeper connections than the superficial ones that society imposes onto us. Van Helsing and Seward, they remain silent, but they all feel guilty because of course they also help save Lucy's life. So they know they shouldn't feel guilty, but for Arthur, this is clearly such an important and tender moment that it feels ashamed to tell him, well, actually Lucy has had not only you, but 4 other grown men. On the way back, Van Helsing bursts into hysterics, and we see this contrast between him as a rational man and him as a very emotional man. So though he's very rational and considerate and he knows the exact perfect mechanisms of growth, he's still a foreigner in terms of the proper behavior for Victorian society, because Seward knows that Victorian society would expect you to hold it in and to not just like give free reign of your emotions. Frankly, it's improper that he's half laughing and half crying at the irony, and so Seward is more aware that Victorian morals at the time would advocate for a certain type of behavior. There is then an excerpt from the Westminster Gazette. A dark lady is grabbing children in the neighborhood around Lucy's burial place. The children are returned with blood on their neck and 2 puncture wounds. More dramatic irony. Before, the excerpt about the wolf was speculated to be written by Mina. Now this one is not by Mina, but about Lucy. Lucy takes center stage, but the attention is negative. She's also described as the dark lady, which is very accurate as she's now a creature of the night, but on the surface she appears innocent with her white dress and purity. All the children report being taken by a blue-fur lady. Some speculate that this is just hysteria and the children use her as an excuse, while we of course can piece together it's just the same woman. We anticipate finding the culprit in the next chapter. Mina decides to finally open the journal, but she doesn't tell Jonathan quite yet, and we can see what sort of shock this has because her diary entries from this time are very much not like her usual I did this and then I did this in a semi-ordered way. No, this is it's clear that she's processing what she has just read, so it's just a few scribbled lines in shorthand like, oh, Jonathan said this, Jonathan said that, I can't believe him, the poor man, poor Dracula, he has actually seen Dracula, the poor man, he's not insane. And she's sort of processing this, and unlike the others, she's the first one to piece it all together. And she also looks to the future. She's a very resourceful woman. She types up her own diary, she types up her diary from the experiences with Lucy at the beach, because she recognizes now that encounter was her encounter with Dracula, and she also begins to type up Jonathan's notes. She then receives a telegram from Van Helsing asking her to meet with him. I rose and bowed, and he came towards me, a man of medium height, strongly built, with his shoulders set back over a broad, deep chest, and a neck well balanced on the trunk as the head is on the neck. The poise of the head strikes one at once as indicative of thought and power. The head is a noble, well-sized, broad, and large behind the ears. The face, clean shaven, shows a hard, square chin, a large, resolute, mobile mouth, a good-sized nose, rather straight, but with quick, sensitive nostrils that seem to broaden as the big, bushy eyebrows come down and the mouth tightens. The forehead is broad and fine, rising at first almost straight and then sloping back above 2 bumps or ridges wide apart. Such a forehead that the reddish hair cannot possibly tumble over it, but falls naturally back to the sides. Big, dark blue eyes are set wildly apart and are quick and tender, or stern was the man's moods. Like Lucy, she sees Van Helsing straight away as a man who inspires confidence. His features are a contrast to Dracula. Where Dracula is thin, and has small piercing red eyes, Helsing's eyes are big and dark blue. He has a very open and resolute face that is clear shaven rather than obscured behind a mustache like Dracula's, because he has nothing to hide. He's the stereotypical hero, the wise man, here to save the Western world with his knowledge. He does not know shorthand and praises Mina for being such a clever woman who types it up in advance, and she understands things far better than the men around her because she recognizes that perhaps what Jonathan has said is actually true, and she gives Van Helsing the diary to read. Overnight, a telegram arrives. You may sleep without doubt. Strange and terrible as it is true. I will pledge my life on it. It may be worse for others, but for him and you there is no dread. He's a noble fellow, and let me tell you from experience of men, that one who would do as he did in going down that wall into that room, and going a second time, is not one to be injured in permanence by shock. This is it. This is assurance that this isn't all some mass-induced hysteria by Jonathan's ravings. Everything starts to fit together into a puzzle, and the novel begins to move towards one timeline. We also see that Van Helsing has a great respect for Mina and her husband because they both manage to remain rational while at the same time not closing their eyes to possibilities. And I think that actually we see that Mina is Van Helsing's star student because he teaches her a lot too, like Seward, but it's not about the education. So of course Mina is also educated, but at the time a teacher would not have been considered as equivalent to a doctor, and especially not a woman. And so I think that this passage in particular shows that it's not just about the university education, it's about being perceptive and smart and being street smart and piecing together when life literally tells you that there's a vampire on the prowl. Van Helsing, Harker, and Mina all dine together, and once they tell Jonathan that actually, no, you're not insane, sorry, Jonathan, it's a sudden change. So whereas before he was this hectic man really concerned with the fact that he's going insane, now he's rational because now he knows that everything he has seen is true, and he begins to address the problem. He trusts Van Helsing with the issue perfectly, and Van Helsing inspires perfect confidence, and actually Van Helsing too is very confident in Harker and Mina and asks him to be their friend. And then he reads the newspaper, the Westminster Gazette, realizes what is going on, and rushes off. We then go back to Seward and Renfield are friends in the institution, and Renfield is actually the same as ever, so he's just collecting flies and spiders and going on about the circle of life. Van Helsing rushes in, he waves the newspaper to Seward, he asks, John, do you realize what is going on? And John makes the connection that the wounds are similar to Lucy, but he does not understand. In seeking to find what caused it, he does not consider the connection, the place. You're a clever man, friend John, you reason well and your wit is bold, but you're too prejudiced. You do not let your eyes see nor your ears hear, and that which is outside your daily life is not of account to you. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand, and yet which are, that some people see things that others cannot, but there are things old and new which must not be contemplated by men's eyes, because they know or think they know some things which other men have told them. It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explains not, then it says there is nothing to explain. This is one of the philosophical main scenes in the novel. Van Helsing argues that magic is anything that is perceived to be as not true. So is science because it is built on assumptions. We cannot see the science and yet we reason. So what's stopping us from making connections to the supernatural as well? Science and religion are not mutually exclusive, as both require opening your heart and believing even when not everyone believes. Seward does not see because he believes it is impossible. He closes off his mind and he closes off the possibilities. What would happen if we went beyond our own prejudices and were more open to the world? What things would we see? What would we be able to know? Seward asks to help him see, to be Van Helsing's students one more and to understand, and he asks, what is your thesis? And the thesis is, believe in things you cannot. I think this is more than just religious preaching. I think this is asking us to consider every factor and every situation, and that's how Seward sees it too. And so he's like, so the wounds on Lucy's neck and the wounds on the children's neck were made by some strange and natural things, and it's so close that the reader just wants to like slap him in the face and say, oh my god, she's the vampire, she's the one drinking the children's blood. We're not the only ones experiencing despair. Van Helsing sinks dramatically, despairingly into a chair and says the wounds were made by Miss Lucy. And on that note, the chapter ends. I know this video series is so long, but there's so much detail in Dracula, and so I hope you are enjoying it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.